Yes, hello folks, welcome to some bonus content on the Global Football Show. I'm your host as always, Phil Brad, joined my regular co-host Zach Lowy. I'm delighted to be joined by a good friend of mine and of course the fantastic Shaun Derry. You need only look at Shaun's resume to see he's had a fantastic playing career, played for some of the biggest clubs in England, coaching career. Most recently, he was at Crystal Palace. He of course was one of the pro development coaches in their academy and was also first team coach under Patrick Vieira. We've got Shaun on the show to talk about youth development, coaching philosophy, youth development. This is something I'm a youth coach, so something that's very important for me, and I know it's important for a lot of other people. And getting some direction on what Premier League academies are prioritising in young kids today. So great podcast. I'm looking forward to doing this. So thanks for coming on, Shaun.
You're welcome. Good to be on.
Absolute pleasure, mate. Shaun, one of the things as a youth coach that I see is there's not even a core agreement on what the primary function of a youth coach is, because I see coaches that think their primary function is to win. And I see other coaches and say that's not the purpose of youth development coaching. The purpose of youth development coaching is individual development. I've spoke to people at Manchester United and they told me if we have an FA Youth Cup winning team and we don't get any of those players into the first team, that is less successful to us than a team that finishes in the bottom half of the table and we get two or three players into the first team. The focus on youth development is about individual improvement. Yes, of course, winning is important, but if you were going to give a philosophy to a young coach, what would it be?
Well, it's a dilemma, isn't it? Because, everyone associates football with winning or losing. So you can get caught in the trap, even in the youth development phases. My son's at an academy, is at the Crystal Palace Academy, and I've seen it from both sides. Of course, I've seen it from a parental point of view, and I've also seen it from a coach's aspect as well. So the conversations that I hear on the inside of a academy football club and some of the conversations I hear out on the field, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes can be a little bit clouded. But ultimately, and this is my outlook on it, is every young player has a different journey. And the player at 8, 12, 16 is not going to be that player at 20, 21, 22. There's so many lines of development, whether that's going to be physical development, whether that's going to be a mental development. So to answer the question for me, I would always try and overload it of the potential of the player changes from year to year. So should it be about winning? Not at all costs for me. Not when you're dealing with 8 to 16-year-olds. I think when you get into the 18s, the under 18s league, and it does become a league in England, I think the aspect of trying to win, of course, is a massive, massive factor, but you still got to try and produce players whilst trying to win.
Shaun, you began your managerial career in 2013 with Notts County, had some spells with Cambridge United as well as Oxford United before returning to Crystal Palace and working not with the first team, but with the club's academy. I'm curious, what was it like to transition from working with professionals, grown men, to working with young footballers?
Well, it was a decision that I wanted to make. If you look at the normal route of a coach, he would probably, if from my perspective, finish playing at 35, then you jump into maybe a youth role, then you go into a phase role with maybe the 18s or the 21s, 23s, and then hopefully you get into the first team. My role was different because it went from playing to managing 1 week to the next. So I did actually miss some key rungs on the ladder. And it was a real, it was a real effort for me to make that decision of coming out of senior football. But I felt I really needed that. I needed that challenge. I needed that information, and I needed that experience to actually see what youth development really looked like when the pressure is not as elevated as it is in the first team. Back at Notts County, we needed to stay in the league, and it was a win at all costs. But even though it was a win at all costs, you still got a large responsibility of producing players and developing players. We had Jack Grealish at Notts County, and he was somebody else's player. He wasn't my player, he wasn't the club's player, he was Aston Villa's player at the time. But we were trusted to develop him in his journey whilst we're still wanting to win for the objective of staying in the league. So I think you're always developing. I think that's the answer I'm trying to come out with, is that you're always developing players.
I want to ask you about how it's changed, because when we were growing up, there was an emphasis on physicality. And I mean, there were certain physical characteristics that were indicative of whether you would make it an academy. Size was one of them. I remember you're too small, you need to be, you need to fill out, things like that. You now see that the game has changed completely in how it's played. Obviously, it's not as physical, and there's much more of an emphasis on technique. What are some of the biggest things that stand out for you that have changed in academy development football from when you were playing?
Well, I mean, back when I was 16 to 18, it was called a YTS. The YTS changed into an apprenticeship, into now what's now the academy, and a scholarship. So, but guys, it's the same. It's just the words changed for that. But my years were spent, if I look back at it through an honest set of eyes, it was overloaded with winning.
Yeah.
Now, I quite liked it because it took me into my phase as a professional footballer of just being so determined to win at all costs. But I wasn't really coached the way that some of the young players are coached now. Some of the young players, again, mentioning my son at the football club, having played through the ranges of under 8s to under 16s, maybe playing with a back three, a back five, a 4-3-3 with a holding midfielder and 2 advanced 8s, changing the ways of playing the game. He's had all that information over the last 8 years. My days were 4-4-2. Yeah. Get it up to the big man, surround it, get the ball wide and cross the ball, and make sure that you're hard to beat on the counter. I think it's a lot more detailed now, with a lot more knowledge from the coaches that are now on the field with the young players.
Shaun, in 1998, you were bought by Sheffield United for £700,000. That was the same year that I was born, coincidentally.
Cheers, that.
Sorry about that. I didn't mean to give you a backhanded insult, but backhanded compliment. But it's safe to say that you've been around the game for a while. Me, reading a lot of historical pieces on English football. I've read a lot of stories about players, smoking a cigar or drinking whiskey before a game and having some less than modern eating habits, shall we say. I'm curious, talk to me a little bit about that aspect of what you do off the pitch, how you eat, how you train. How do you think that has changed in the 3 decades or so that you've been in this game?
Oh, I mean, the professionalism has come on leaps and bounds. You mentioned 1998. I remember my first week having signed for Sheffield United. I'd played on the Saturday against Lincoln for Notts County. I actually remember being drunk on the Sunday while speaking to Sheffield United, because I'd been out that night and had such a heavy night that I was still kind of hungover. And I got sold on that Sunday morning from the chairman who rang my home phone. I was living with my mum and dad at the time, saying, "We've got a big meeting at 12 o'clock. We've just agreed a deal with Sheffield United." And I'm hungover from the night before. I had no idea I was signing for Sheffield United. So you can imagine, you can imagine how times have changed now, and the habits that the players are accustomed with now. They're not just come this last 5 years. This changed and transformed when I was playing. The impetus of foreign players maybe coming into the top 2 leagues, the Premier League and the Championship in England. Probably, if I look back when I was 26, 27, sharing changing rooms with, European players who had different habits. and different beliefs about looking after the body. So it did rub off on the British lads, and I actually believe now that if my habits would have been better from maybe 16 onwards up until, that 28-year-old who suddenly recognised there was a different way of living his life away from the football pitch, I think I'd have probably got more out of my career.
It's a really good question because the sports science has evolved. We understand physiology better, we understand diet better. We also understand some of the other intersectional issues that we didn't learn about, such as psychology and mental health and everything. Professional academies in England are sending kids from as young as 9. When does the conversation start about nutrition? When does the conversation start about how kids are living outside of football and giving themselves the best chance to succeed? I mean, if you're managing kids, not even at Premier League academy, if you're coaching kids, when do you start having conversations with them about how they, and even and emphasize fitness? Do you do fitness work with 9-year-olds, or do you just trust they're naturally fit? That's not something you de-emphasize. And do you have conversations about nutrition?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at a Crystal Palace academy, just the academy facility alone, take away the first team site, which has got, I'm guessing, maybe close to 70 people working on that site. If you look at the academy, there's got to be close to maybe 150 people work inside the academy. Not all of them are coaches, by the way. They are going to be psychologists, nutritionalists. At Crystal Palace, there's full-time teachers there. So these boys are being taught from such an early age the importance of it not just being what is developed on the football pitch. Yeah. It's everything that goes off it. So it's not just the kids either. It's the parents that need to be educated. And Crystal Palace spend a lot of time putting on events purely for the parents, because if you can influence the parent, they obviously carry the biggest influence on the child. The parents and the guardians who look after these children, and they are children, and not all of them are going to come through to make it as professional footballers. Obviously the filtering system where you start with this amount of players and suddenly, it kind of crescendos into maybe 1 or 2 coming through at each age group. Mm-hmm. So I think the responsibility from the football club is not just to look at the elite player. It's to look at the elite professionalism within the player at the football club.
Crystal Palace, when you compare them over the past few seasons, it's almost night and day. They've gone from being the oldest team in the Premier League to a team with plenty of young stars and, have produced quite a few academy players such as Tyrick Mitchell and Aaron Wan-Bissaka. I want to talk a little bit about your role in the Palace Academy because it does seem like they have modernized quite a bit. They've invested a lot of money and put a lot of their resources into this in order to shore up so much of the talent in South London. So, yeah, can you just talk to me a little bit about your experience with them?
Well, of course, coming from a first-team environment, having left Oxford and coming into Crystal Palace, it was a transition football club. And I say that not on the pitch, but off the pitch. The academy didn't have a home in terms of a fantastic facility. So you mentioned some of the players that have come through, but unfortunately, Crystal Palace have lost a few players purely because they've not had the facility to keep the better players inside South London. They maybe have lost them to an Arsenal, a Tottenham, a West Ham, a Fulham, whoever it would be. But now they've got this super, multi-million-pound facility, which is state-of-the-art, which arguably is up there with the best facilities in London. It allows that football club to keep their best players, which is so important because, when you think about how much money gets paid into developing these players, the club are now saying, well, we've now got the facility, we've now got the infrastructure and the resources available. Now the pressure's on of developing more and more to coming into the first team. Now that's the next challenge. So when I first came, we were I think, in the 6th or the 7th year of our tenure in the Premier League. The football club's now entering its 9th or 10th year. So, it's a football club now that understands the Premier League, and it understands that, unfortunately, that bracket from mid to lower end of the Premier League play probably the least amount of football in the whole pyramid of English football. You've got the Premier League season, which carries 38 games. They're not playing in the Elite Champions League or, the Europa Leagues. There's probably the two competitions, the League and the FA Cup. The likelihood is it's going to be an exit at maybe the 3rd or the 4th round. So if you accumulate all the games available to that bottom half of the Premier League teams like Crystal Palace would find it very, very difficult to blood a young player into their match day 11. How often do Crystal Palace and so many teams around them fortunate enough to be in a position of 3 and 4-0 comfortable in a Premier League game, like maybe you would see a Manchester City or a Liverpool or an Arsenal? So it's very difficult to blood a young player. But the challenge now on this football club is, can they get another Tyrick Mitchell into the team, and can he be a regular? Can they get another Aaron Wan-Bissaka, not only starting, but ultimately selling him on for over 50 million? That's the big challenge for the football club.
So I want to ask you something that's a relatively new problem, certainly different from when you and I were young. When we were kids, we played football on the street. Today, kids have different interests. They've got video games. They're much more solitary. They've got lots of other things going on in their lives. And so this begs a couple of questions. One, if you're sitting down with a parent, how often should kids be playing? How often should you be playing outside structured coaching? Given the fact that it's not realistic for kids to play 3 hours a day with a coach whenever they're not at professional academies. A lot of the game for street footballers was learned on the street, refined by coaches, good habits that coach bad habits out of you. I have kids that are, a couple of training sessions a week in the game a weekend. I'm telling them it's not enough for that rapid development. If you were talking to a parent, how often should kids be playing where they would be competitive at a level where they could expect to progress to that's competitive with kids in the UK?
Well, it's a great question. It really is. I mean, again, if I rewind the clock to my time as a young player, it would have been playing Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, Sunday, and maybe for my school on a Wednesday.
Yeah.
Well, if you look back, that was too much. And within that, you're still on the park at night with all your mates after school until, the gatekeeper kicks you out at 9 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
It's a lot more structured now, and there's a lot more science behind the development of young players. I like the fact that there's still super players coming through with unbelievable individuality and creativity in their game. And I think at times, I think we coach that out of them by being very robotic in what we're asking of the players. So to capture that balance is a real dilemma for a football club at all levels. I mean, you'll get players coming, not so often now, but when I was playing, they would come from a non-league background, maybe a lower League Two, a League One, and then find themselves into the Premier League. It's very rare that you see that journey now. So it kind of questions me of what are we doing with the young kids? Are we just coaching them purely with tunnel vision of this is the structure and we're not going to bend of it? Right. Or are we going to be a little bit more lenient and allow the individual come out in the player? I'd like us to be... I loved Jack Grealish. He was 17 when he was with me. He was 17. He was a year older than my son. But he excited me every day. Come on the pitch. And he wasn't interested in an 11v11 tactical session. He wanted an 11v11 game where he was up against his right back and he was available to showcase his supreme individual ability. I watch players now on a Sunday or on a Saturday morning in the academies, and they don't shine like that. There's great players in the academy, but sometimes I just see the coaches and I just think that's too structured.
Yes.
We're kind of inhibiting the player that's on the pitch. I don't
Shaun,
know
you
if that
mentioned,
answers the question.
Yeah. I
Shaun,
completely
you
agree.
mentioned that supreme individual talent like Jack Grealish. There was a recent article by The Athletic talking about Mason Greenwood and how during his youth days at Manchester United, he wouldn't be afraid to tell a player that they were bad and that he was better than them. I'm curious, how do you deal with players like Greenwood, who are clearly world-class talents, but perhaps are a bit of a strain on the team dynamic? Going up against players who probably won't make it, probably won't have a professional career, but are still, very important to the team's chemistry.
I'd probably like to change the name of Greenwood, if I may,
Hmm.
but I understand the question. Um, I'd like to perhaps put it in a different way. Of you've got this unbelievable individual talent, but he has challenges along the way that sometimes suppresses other players within the group. Now, of course, you see that. You see that at all football clubs. Take not just Premier League academies. You can go on to watch a local team and you'll
Yeah.
see this lovely little player, but he has a terrible attitude alongside it. For me, the only way, and I've said this for a long time now, the only way you can try and get some sort of professionalism, understanding, respect into a challenged young person is to take the game away from them. Now, everybody goes to football, or I would say 99% of kids go to football because they love playing football. For me, you've got to go there and you've got to be respectful to everybody's joys and hopes and aspirations of wanting to be the best and trying to be a young player. If there's somebody there who's really a problem, take the game away from them. And I can guarantee that as soon as they stop playing for your football club or for their football club, it won't be for a long time. They'll soon adapt very, very quickly. Or you might have to change the environment slightly. There might be two or three that are maybe affecting each other negatively. You might want to push one into a different group. If we're talking about 12, 13-year-olds, there might be somebody who's maybe physically developed as a 12 or 13-year-old. Well, go and push them into the under 14s.
Yeah.
Maybe one of them's challenged differently, mentally challenged slightly differently, and he's underdeveloped. Well, go and throw him into an under 11s category. But you've got to break that trend, because if you don't break it early, it does become a problem.
I've actually experienced the opposite problem. I've had kids that are exceptionally talented, but they come from troubled backgrounds and they're riddled with imposter syndrome, and they feel unequal to their peers because perhaps their parents have substance abuse issues, or they're coming from an equivalent economic background where they're not wearing the nice boots. I've seen kids who don't have the confidence to succeed at a higher level. They have the talent to succeed at a higher level, but they don't have that self confidence. They're not getting that support from home. They're not getting that support from peers around them, and it's extremely tragic because I see a lot of kids who don't make it to the highest or not realize their potential because they're psychologically traumatized and they have this imposter, like as soon as I get here I'm going to get found out, and they lack the confidence to succeed in pressure situations where they feel like failure is inevitable, and I've come across that a few times. I would imagine that with you were saying, Shaun, that with the academies in the Premier League they're quite tuned into that now, where they're looking at kids' backgrounds and seeing talent isn't enough. We need to make sure this kid has the psychological tools to be successful, whether it's in football or life, and they're given the therapy or support to believe in themselves.
Yeah, and I think the challenge you've got there, Phil, is the fact that if you've got brilliant infrastructure, resources available to you, we talk about the coaches around the coaches, the team, the psychologists, all these different people who could potentially help this young player. It takes me back to what the objective is. Is the objective one size fits all, or can we be a little bit more individual with these kids? The challenge of getting the best out of you, Phil, to the best out of you, Zach, to the best out of me are going to be all very different.
Yes.
And the pathway's not going to be the same. So the coaches, whether that's a one-man band coach who takes his local team on a Saturday afternoon, I think you've got to be quite receptive to this idea of maybe slightly adapting for certain people to try and get the best out of them.
Shaun, if we could just rewind the clock back 30 years ago to when you were making your first steps into professional football with Notts County and compare it with today, I'm curious, how would you compare the biggest challenges facing young and up-and-coming footballers? You mentioned that your son is at Crystal Palace's academy. I'm curious, as a former academy coach, what would you regard as the biggest challenges that these players are going through, and are there any things in particular that you've discussed with him that you really want to help him, try to get past in his mission to become a professional footballer?
Well, it's again another brilliant question, Zach. I've got to say, of course, Jesse, my son, is he's lucky. He's lucky that his dad's had that experience, not only playing but obviously coming out and managing and coaching now. So I'd like to think I can give him some advice, but this is his career, and it's something that I have to support and respect the journey that he's on. If I was to just tell a story about, I finished my exams at 16, and I think a week later, I joined pre-season for Notts County. And I didn't just join pre-season with 16, 17 and 18-year-olds. Back then, it was the youth team and the first team. So I've gone from this secure environment of school and being a little bit, wet between the ears to actually going in the big, bad, bold world of professional football. I had to catch 3 buses to get to training. It took me about an hour and a half in the morning. There wasn't that kind of fortune of being taken to training in a minibus, or whether you're picked up by one of the drivers at the academies, or my mum and dad both worked full time. So it was up to me as a 16-year-old to get on them 3 buses, to actually put myself in an environment that I didn't really understand. This was men. My first pre-season was with 20 other players ranging from 22 to 37 years old. I'm literally being thrown at the deep end, and it was you had to swim to survive, and those, I remember looking back at some of the talent that was in our group, and it just didn't come through, and it was heartbreaking, because the challenge wasn't just on the pitch, it was actually off it, where we lost some of these players at Notts County. Now fast forward then 30 years, thankfully now we understand, the challenges that these 16-year-olds face, which is why for the first 6 months, I speak to a coach at Crystal Palace called Paddy McCarthy.
Yeah.
And he's a wonderful developer of young people. And we was talking about how he integrated the schoolboy age group into what's now the professional phase age group, which is the under 18s. And he was explaining to me about how he gives them 6 months. I give these kids 6 months. They're coming from school. They're finding their own way to training. They're out of this secure net of under 16 football, and now we're asking different challenges of them. So for the first 6 months, the football club just take a breather and relax. And if they come through, brilliant. If they don't come through, then there's no pressure on these lads to even play for the under 18s in that first 6 months at Crystal Palace, which I think is brilliant. I do. And when you now add what the next layer of development looks like, which is the senior development phase, which is the under 21s league, you've got another opportunity to develop, not just physically, because I think that the average player now, I think he stops growing at 22 years old. So you've got that extra time to physically develop, but mentally develop as well. It's such a massive part of being a footballer. Look back at me as a 16-year-old. I was very different as a 16-year-old to what I was as a 21-year-old, and even more so as a 30 and a 35-year-old. Everyone develops very differently.
A couple of questions left, mate. These are excellent, really interesting. I want to ask you about, you're someone that obviously understands the game on a profound level. And when you're going to youth games, you're going to games around the country, are there any characteristics that you see in coaches on the sideline where you think immediately that's a problem? I mean, I'm specifically thinking about coaches that are screaming at players, right? That are punishing players, that are asking players to do things they've never showed them how to do, or asking players to do things they can't do. Or is some of that necessary? I mean, if you were to see something in a coach that would immediately offend your sensibilities, what would those characteristics be?
I mean, over aggression would be a red sign for me. And I have seen some fantastic young coaches, brilliant developers of young people on the sideline. But I think the stage of an under 18 player, and then even more so into that 21, is, listen, we're now quickly getting out of that potential stage to actually producing. You know, I call it the two P's. When you're on one side of the academy, it's potential. You're on the first team side, it's producing performances, producing results. You know, being a footballer, being a professional footballer is very different in a first team environment. So how do you look at that coach? I think you need a little bit of both. I think you need the guy who's going to put his arm around you at certain times, but you also need that guy who's going to, hold you accountable to some of your actions in a way that sounds like it would sound in 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time, when that opportunity, comes your way. What I would say, and this is just something, again, just an idea of mine, is that, and it happened to me, when you're stood on the sideline and you're engrossed in the game, you can miss so much.
Yeah.
You do, because you're in it. You're literally stood on top of players. You're right on top. You don't see that kind of picture from above. And I've always said in development football, to have that coach sat up in the stands, it doesn't have to be the lead coach, it can be a supporting coach. But somebody sat up there that sees it from a different set of eyes is so important. Because, like I've just said there, I miss so much as a coach and a manager by, not having that guy sat up in the stand. I think it's something that we should really look at.
It's really interesting.
Shaun, you've had the chance to work with a variety of clubs as a first-team coach as well as an academy coach. Recently ended a 3.5-year spell at Crystal Palace in January. I'm curious, what is the next step for you? What are some things that you're looking for in your next opportunity? Where do you feel right now at this point in your career?
Well, football management and football coach, unfortunately, doesn't last forever. You find yourself out of work, or you find yourself maybe, having to pause for a slight moment to maybe see what develops at that particular football club, which is the case that I'm in with Crystal Palace. So I'm just taking a little bit of time at the minute just to try and educate myself a little bit more by of course, I want to be a coach. I want to be a first team manager again. That's the objective for me. But when I mentioned earlier on in the interview about, missing certain rungs of the ladder, I don't think you ever learn it all.
Yeah.
You get, for the last 4.5 years, well, 4 years, I've been at Crystal Palace. So I've only seen what Crystal Palace does day to day. You're in it, aren't you? You know what it's like, guys, at work.
Right.
You're in it. Everything kind of takes control of you, and then you go home and
Yeah.
you try and breathe a little bit. Well, that's what's been happening for me for the last 4 years. I've been so engrossed in the football club that now I'm looking at different clubs. I'm looking at different structures of football clubs. I'm seeing different levels of player again. I've been working in the Premier League for 18 months. I'm now watching Championship, League One and League Two again, and just seeing what's happening at them
Absolutely.
levels. Seeing young players coming through, maybe lads who are being developed at 19, 20 years old that are playing senior football in League Two. That's not been an opportunity for me in the last 18 months. So also, I think what you've got to also try and do is keep your networks hot, and go and meet different people. And that's what I've been doing, So this opportunity that I've still got with Crystal Palace at the minute is just taking a little bit of time just to breathe and reset, really.
I mean, one thing I don't envy you that is consistent no matter what level of football you coach at is the rejection part of football, of how you have to tell a kid that they are, unfortunately, you have to cut them loose, and doing that at any level of football is utterly excruciating. And it's something that, I was thinking about earlier when you were mentioning about how much kids should play, and I'm like, if you dedicate your whole life to this and you get cut loose at 18, we had a situation with an 18-year-old at City who took his life after being cut 2 years in 2020, how difficult that is, and you realise that a big part of what you do is how you communicate, and it's not what it's how you communicate what you know, and how in tune you are with people's feelings, and how to do that constructively so that they grow from the experience rather than they feel diminished from it. I would
Yeah.
say communication and how to communicate is a big part of coaching that you've had to learn. Well, last question, I'll let you go.
No, it's everything, Phil. It's everything. Behind that number on that player's back, there's a person inside that shirt.
Yeah, so hard.
And it's very difficult. That you're absolutely right. That was probably the hardest part of my time as a coach and a manager. Is I found it more difficult telling the 18, 19, 20-year-old than I probably did telling the 28-year-old,
Yeah,
because the 28-year-old has probably sat in that room many times before and either been told, yes, you're getting a contract, or no, you're not. But at least he knew what it felt like in them rooms. If it's the first time rejection comes to some of these young players, you've got to be very careful how you administer that rejection.
absolutely.
And this is where, we talk about rejection for players, but rejection for parents as well, and guardians. Them guys, mums and dads and guardians have been there for most situations every step of the way. Sat there in the, pouring rain, watching their kids train 4 or 5 nights a week, playing, and maybe got other children in the household where they've had to maybe push one to one side. So you're giving everything to this great
Yeah,
opportunity for your son, or for your son or daughter, and it's heartbreaking. And I find it never gets easier as the years go by. Every single time you're faced with that conversation, leading into that conversation, I have tough nights of, sleepless nights, thinking about how to say it and what to say. Does one of the kids want it just done and dusted in 2 minutes? Does somebody want an hour with you? It's very difficult.
yeah, I completely agree, mate. And that's the other ugly side of this that people don't get to see. It's not all glamour. Shaun, it's been an absolute pleasure, mate. Zach, are you done, Paul? You got any questions, or are we done?
Yeah. Shaun, just one more question. I know we've talked about a lot of the changes that have occurred in your 3 decades in football. One of the changes is this generation of footballers are using technology, specifically social media, to interact with fans, fellow players. That's something that can bring positive and negative consequences, as we all know. I'm curious, though, what effects do you see that social media and technology is having in this next generation of young footballers? And is that something that you are particularly concerned with as a father?
Yeah, because we'll be sat here in the kitchen in the living room at night, and my kids will have their phones barely half a yard away from them all the time. And it's something that I'm always kind of little reminders to them. Family time's important time, and phones, we'd like the phones to go away, but I'm not naive enough to think that as soon as he leaves that kitchen, he goes in his bedroom, he's bang on that phone again. When I was a kid, if I wanted a new pair of trainers, I used to have to wait until them shops opened on a Monday morning at 10 o'clock. If I, and hopefully I've saved up loads of money to buy them trainers, and I'd have to jump on that bus, get myself down into central Nottingham and go and buy them and get back on the bus again. You can get things in an absolute click of a thumb now. You press, if there was a grievance from a fan, and he had a problem with the manager, you'd hope that fan would take the time to write a letter, put a stamp on it, and go and deliver it in the Royal Mail box, and it would be hand delivered to the manager, and you'd hope he would read it and get back to you. Now, social media, you can do anything, and within a second, it's at the other end. That's exactly where players are now. They want things now.
Yeah.
And the patience that you have to give football, it actually, what I'm saying is, they've got to understand that they've got to be patient, these young players. The boy at 16 is not the man at 27. There's a patience that takes place, and the journey, you've got to trust the journey. You can't go and buy your trainers in a heartbeat, guys. You've got to wait until the right time. And your right time might be 19. It might be, if you're at one of these top academies that have category 1 under 21s team that cater to wait for the better players, you might not be making your first team debut until you're 23. So please understand the process. That's what I would say to these young players. And I say this to Jesse all the time.
It's a great point. I was 16
Make
years old and had the same
sure
conversation.
You come home from every training session a little bit better to when you left.
It's a good point. Yeah, that's how winning progress is made. Shaun, thank you so much, mate. It's been a wonderful conversation. Really appreciate it. Keep in touch with me. I'll reach out to you on WhatsApp, mate. Thank you very much for everything. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Good to meet you,
Cheers,
Zach.
Bob.
Take care.
See you, mate. Bye.